International Humanitarian Law Dialogues at Chautauqua, for organizing them and for inviting me to speak both today and tomorrow. Tomorrow was a topic that dealt with the generalities of the Arab Spring. Today it's the specificities of accountability. So it's a bit of an intellectual challenge to speak about the specificities before the generalities, but I hope you will be able to make the transition. Let me start by saying that we still call it the Arab Spring, though, as you know, the Arab Spring has fastly moved into a hot summer, and the hot summer, without any transitioning through fall, moved into a bitter winter. We are now living into the bitter winter of the Arab Spring. And it's important to keep in mind certain generalities before going into the specificities. And the first generality that probably most people who are not historians of the Arab world will probably not readily see is that the Arab world has been in a revolutionary fervor since the end of World War I. I wrote a book in 1973 called The Arab Revolution, and Arnold Toynbee was gracious enough to write the foreword to it. We were both together at Stanford University teaching at the time. I was a very, very modest young man, and he, of course, was an extraordinary luminary. But I had latched on to this idea that the Arab world was truly going through a very deep-rooted revolution. And in one of the sentences in the foreword, in my introduction to the book, I said, if Israel didn't exist at all, the Arab world would still be in torment and turmoil, because what is happening in the Arab world has nothing to do with this particular factor, which may be, like other aggravating factors, a factor, but it is not the central factor. The Arab world, if you have to look at its history, has been integrated into the Islamic nation as early as about 636, 637 for Palestine, what is now Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, 642 Egypt. By 646 it was all of North Africa. By 650 it was Mesopotamia, and then from that point on, the Arab identities, please emphasize that, of each and every Arab countries were subsumed in the Islamic identity. But as the Islamic world and its history changed, and the Muslim Ummah converted into a Muslim empire, and the empire in turn broke down into multiple different Muslim regimes, so did the Arab world go through these transformations and convulsions without ever gaining its identity. Come the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and for almost until the 15th century, in the 15th century, until the end of World War I, the Turkish Ottoman Empire dominates. During World War I, you have the beginning of the boiling of the Arab Revolution manifesting itself into Arab nationalism. And the sense of Arab nationalism which emerges is a very nationalistic sense. And you can see a vast difference between the sort of pro-intellectual French influence of the Syrian-Lebanese elite in the early 1920s, as opposed to the Egyptian anti-colonial, anti-British movement, and different other manifestations of Arab nationalism arising. The movement results in a number of conflicts and finally obtaining of the independence of these countries, each one of these countries seeking its identity, only to discover that it had traded off the rulers of the Turkish Ottoman Empire to local dictators, local Ottomans, so to speak of. And from there, it moved away from colonialism only to find itself under the colonial empire of monarchies or military regimes or others. And then in the 50s comes out the idea of Arab nationalism, a new sort of a union that links a sense of Arabism and Islamism together, tied in with a portion of a new ideology which at the time was a mixture of socialism and Marxism that arises together. That movement rises once again to find itself fighting the new neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, and its remnants represented by the different tyrannical monarchies and military dictatorship that existed. Now that, in a sense, ended with the defeat of Egypt in 1967. The limited military victory of Egypt in 1973 was not an Arab manifestation. It was exclusively an Egyptian manifestation. It remained limited to that. Egypt moved in the direction of Camp David. The rest of the Arab world didn't really follow. From 78 on, Egypt was the only country for all practical purposes to have moved in the direction of peace with Israel. 79 comes the peace treaty with Israel. It was not until 1993 that Jordan follows with its peace treaty. Israel is still not part of the region that it is part of geographically, probably for two reasons. One, the Arab world rejects it, and two, I think the Israelis have never really opted for being part of that region. Instead, they see themselves more as an extension of the West. In the midst of that turmoil, the sense of Arab nationalism, the sense of something of a conceptual idea that ties the Arabs together, sort of breaks apart. The Nasserite idea of Arab socialism, Arab nationalism, quickly disappears. Local nationalism remains, but it remains more in a sentimental type of nature. It is at that point that you have to look at the different revolutionary movements, as I would call them, in each and every Arab country. You look at, for example, as we will talk about it since it is relevant to our question today, you look at the movement in Algeria. Algeria goes through a very difficult revolutionary war, particularly during the period of 1956 in the Battle of Algiers. A country of 10 million people lost about 1 million of its people. There has never been any post-conflict justice in Algeria for the 1 million people who were lost. And the scars of that remains. What is it replaced with? A military dictatorship. What did the people gain? And so you have the only thing left at that point is the Islamic ideal. And the Islamic ideal manifests itself in the feast, the front, the Islamic front. It wins an election, like the Muslim Brotherhood won the election, but maybe more decisively in Algeria. The military do not allow that election to stand, and the feast is removed from power, and the military is back in control, back repressing the freedoms of society, in the hope, however, of trying to rebuild the society. So the dilemma of Algeria is, how do you rebuild the economy, how do you rebuild the society, and yet at the same time give a little bit of democracy and freedom. The problem is, democracy and freedom is not something that you can give in small pieces. You can't be partially pregnant If you are a woman, you're either pregnant or you're not. You either have freedom or you don't. You either have democracy or you don't. So the idea of having a military regime doling out bits and pieces of democracy and freedom never works out. It didn't work out in Algeria, and it didn't work out in other countries. In Tunisia, you have an extraordinary leader that takes Tunisia out of French colonialism. He establishes himself as president. His name is Bourguiba. At the beginning, he is highly respected and loved by his people. Establishes an extraordinary policy, the only country in the world that I know of, that devoted a substantial portion of its budget to national education. No army, very small budget for the army, very enlightened approach, but as Abraham Lincoln says, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so it is, after a period of time, Bourguiba becomes old and too much in power, and he too becomes corrupted and absolutely corrupted, and the people rebel. Tunisia demonstrates that an international civil society existed as of the 50s, and the international civil society rises up. And a lot of very senior intellectuals are part of the movement that removes Bourguiba and Zayn al-Abidin takes over. And there was an idea then that things were going to change, except that Zayn al-Abidin, a former officer, former Minister of Interior, engages in the same type of repressions and even worse than those that Bourguiba did. And so suddenly the people find themselves in that situation, and that is then accompanied by what is usually the case whenever you have these types of repressions. Corruption is the appendage to repression. Corruption invariably happens whenever you do not have the shining lights of transparency that democracy usually brings about, with all its faults anyway. And so suddenly the people have to find a way of rebelling against it. And they rebel. And again, it's the Islamists that win. Why? Because there is no other ideology that can prevail. The pan-Arab ideology failed. The nationalistic ideology failed. The communist ideology failed. This morning, Prince Zayd was saying we need to develop a new indigenous ideology. There is no indigenous ideology. So there is a vacuum. The only ideology that prevails is the Islamist ideology. And the Islamist ideology, and I think somebody was asking the question, the Islamist ideology is one that is, in a sense, extraordinarily, I want to use the word socialistic. The Islamic ideology is that everybody in a society is part of a society, and everybody has an obligation to provide for society. So it's a very socialistic approach. You can almost say, and I don't mean to be heretical in that respect, that you can sort of see the historic background of the tribalism that existed in the southern Arabian Peninsula. The sense of tribalism where everybody in the tribe is concerned about everybody else. Where individual rights are not that important, it's the tribal societal rights that are the most important. And in a sense, as you look at the applicability of this type of a doctrine on a nationwide basis, you find it antithetical to individual rights, and therefore antithetical to the Western approach and concept of individualism and individual rights, of freedom of the individual within a society, because it is always the collective rights that prevail. It could work very well in the most enlightened society, but in a society, again, as Prince Zayd was mentioning, which lacks substantially in human development, suddenly what you see is you see the society sinking down to its lowest common denominator. And individuals who could be emerging and who could pull the society upwards are the ones who are then now submerged and dragged down into the society, prevented from emerging, leading, and moving the society upwards. And so here we have the Tunisian revolution coming up. and the transformation takes place. And I hope that Greta and Jamil will not find what I say too troublesome, but there is a high level of discourse in Tunisia about transitional justice, even a Ministry of Transitional Justice, but that's because Tunisia has always had a civil society and a history in human rights organization and political activism with a lot of support from the outside. Tunisia has a lot of support in Italy, in France, people who live in Italy and in France, and so all of that carries with it a certain impetus. But at the governmental level, frankly, I'm going to borrow Brenda's style, which I'm totally in agreement with, nothing is happening. So you have a ministry for transitional justice, you don't have transitional justice. You have two major assassinations of two major political, nothing is happening. You say, well, what are we going to do? So we have one prosecution in absentia of the former president, but that's about it. What's happening to all of the other people? To all of the people in the military, in the police? Nothing. A lot of talk, nothing is happening. But at least in Tunisia, you have that voice that's there. You have the activists that are still keeping the idea alive. You move from there into Libya. I had the privilege of serving as the United Nations Commission of Inquiry in Libya as chair. The chair then passed to a member of the commission, my colleague Philippe Kirsch. I remained on it. We both consider ourselves interchangeable because we sort of think alike and work very well together. We went there, and as was said this morning, you have the ICC trying to get Saif Islam and Senussi, two fairly bad characters. Senussi certainly, Saif probably is bad. We've met with Senussi, and what's the problem? Well, until today, in Libya, the different military groups are holding about 8,000 people in their prisons. And these people have been held for close to a year. They started with about 12,000. They ransomed them. These are their meal tickets. Because the people who have joined in the fight, especially in the last 2 months of the fight, when they saw that the fight was going to be a certain success, there wasn't going to be anything lost. The weapons were just piled up because Qaddafi used to buy all sorts of weapons. You could go into any open depots of weapons in the desert and pick up a Kalashnikov and declare yourself a member of this brigade or that brigade, and divided into 4 zones, other than the government zone, with each brigade controlling access and demanding payment, and on occasion fighting each other's out. And then suddenly we discovered that there was a transitional justice law, and the transitional justice law had been promoted by the Islamists in Libya, who wanted to use it as a way of ransoming people out of jail, who would then in turn pledge their loyalty to the Islamists. And in a tribal society like that of Libya, you get one person out, you have 100 votes that come with it. And so it became a whole political bag, in addition to something of great financial consideration. Ideas about prosecutions, of course, fell by the wayside. Nobody is willing to prosecute. There were a lot of violations committed by, let's call them the Thawars, as they were called, or the rebels, against a number of people, particularly the Tawargas, who had been moved inland from the Qaddafi regime. These people have been displaced and strongly mistreated. Again, nothing happened there. On the Egyptian side, the idea of transitional justice Am I wrong?
Yes.
Thank you. On the Egyptian side, the situation is much worse, not likely to get any better. The early beginnings in Egypt were to maybe try to look at the violations committed by the Mubarak regime. That did not work out too well because the people of the Mubarak regime were still in control of the country. The then Attorney General Abdel Mahmoud was appointed by Mubarak and a close friend of his, and he was the one who was supposed to prosecute him. And so, it was very interesting that Mubarak was prosecuted on a legal theory that doesn't exist in the Egyptian criminal code. And that is basically a theory of command responsibility for failure to act. And that doesn't exist in the civilian criminal code. And so, while he was convicted at trial, he was acquitted at the Supreme Court level. Nonetheless, he was kept in prison. Now, of course, he is released because rightfully so, there's no basis for it. Nobody really borrowed to go after him for the major corruption of his time. His two sons, with all of the corruption they've been involved in, were prosecuted only for having bought 2 subsidized villas in Sharm el-Sheikh at a reduced price. So of all of their 20 years of corruption and multi-million dollars they made, this was the only charge brought against them. And so all of the 22 major corruption cases that were brought by the prosecutors of the former regime, nothing of this happened. So the whole thing collapsed. You suddenly have this very fast transformation of the elections, the reaction to the election, and so on. And the bottom line is this: on 21 August, just a few days ago, the cabinet in Egypt decided against having a truth commission or an investigation commission or nothing of the sort. There were 3 plans on the table. One plan was for a national commission. The other plan was a commission similar to Bahrain with mixed international participation. A third was for a commission of inquiry established by the Human Rights Council. All 3 were rejected, and the plan that was approved in paragraph 11 of the decision of the Council was to establish local committees of reconciliation. Nothing much is going to happen to it. The Muslim Brotherhood rejects it entirely. Instead, the Muslim Brotherhood is mounting an international campaign to seize the ICC on the ground that the killing of a religious group is a form of genocide, and if you don't like genocide or you can't make it work, make crimes against humanity work. So that's the new external campaign. So what you saw in the street is now giving way to a campaign for that justice. The new regime said we'll establish a Ministry of Transitional Justice, and then the judiciary opposed it, so the Minister of Transitional Justice could not become Minister of Justice as well, so he was shunted aside. It took him 3 weeks to get 3 offices in the former Senate building, and for all practical purposes, his entire work is being marginalized. At the Geneva level, HRC, Egypt, and a number of states supporting it are opposed to having a commission of inquiry. They're even opposed to having a special debate on Egypt in the Human Rights Council. There is going to be a general discussion of what is to happen. Not likely that anything much will happen. I'll jump from there to Syria. As you know, the HRC has established a commission of inquiry. First it had 3 members, then it had 5 members. With the exception of 1 member, Karen Kearney Abu Zaid, none of them have any experience in the Middle East nor speak the language. They have remained ensconced on the 4th floor of Palais Wilson in Geneva for a good year and a half. Recently, they have just taken a trip to some refugee camps in Jordan and in Turkey, and that is the extent of their fact-finding. Nothing much is likely to come out of that. There are efforts by some NGOs, including efforts by organizations such as the one led by Muhammad Abdullah and others, who are trying to obtain and collect evidence. That's both working out of Washington as well as Lyon, France. Another organization in London is trying to collect the data. There is a plan by these organizations to do transitional justice. There was some thoughts of that, and a plan was submitted to the GCC Council, which unfortunately did not gain much support. So the likelihood that there will be transitional justice at this point, in my opinion, is inexistent. If there is to be a Geneva meeting in September that will start the process of establishing a transition towards non-conflict, the first casualty is going to be transitional justice. Because the reaching of a political settlement is necessarily going to involve making sure that Assad and his family, as well as the Alawis, are going to have some type of impunity situation. Memories of the Lomé Agreement will be there, though everybody has learned their lessons. It's not going to be put in writing, but it's going to happen sub rosa. So that's what it is. With respect to Yemen, the former president has left the presidency on the condition of getting an amnesty law. He obtained the amnesty law. There was some support of it in 2 resolutions by the United Nations, and everybody is eager to make sure that the amnesty law remains in place because they don't want to have another sectarian war going on there. In the, if you will, up and down of peace justice, and instead of calling it peace justice, let me call it political settlement versus justice. This is the time at which throughout the Arab world the goal is reach political settlements, dampen the violence, restore normalization. We'll talk about justice at another time. The problems in the Arab world are economic, they're social, the problems of human development are very serious, economic development are very serious. These societies are very unstable, and the risk of another revolutionary trend is very probable. This time it's quite possible that the Islamists will find a way of communicating within all of these countries so that the next revolutionary wave will not be on a country-by-country basis. It will be a revolutionary wave that will be spurred by the Islamist movements and that will have connections between them, and thus much more serious impact geopolitically in the region, and from there possibly in the Gulf, with increased geopolitical considerations, particularly for the United States, with, of course, the big role of Iran to be played in the picture. So, transitional justice in all of these countries in which you have had a prior accumulation of violations which required some type of transitional justice, no matter what the mechanism is it a truth commission or other, is non-existent. May I say that also in all of that discourse, the one thing that I find rather, what should I say, I want to use the word deplorable of not hearing, is victims' rights. Nobody speaks of victims' rights, and that's what it's all about. And unless we start putting the victim at the heart of whatever initiative we want to take, it's not going to be enough for us to say, well, let's try to prosecute. The prosecution is only a small part of it, and it cannot be the primary part. Prosecutions do not write the record of history. They do not right the wrongs of those who have been victimized.